So we'll learn it from the perspective of Kinyan Torah and from the perspective of parenting. And the topic for today, our title, is to be a superstar parent. That's how we're going to approach this chapter in Pirkei Avot. The chapter opens up with the following perspective. It says, if someone wants to own Liknot Torah, they have to be willing to do mi'ut shena and mi'ut ta'anug. What does that mean? It means if a person really wants Torah to become his or hers, there has to be a level of sacrifice. There's going to be a trade-off. Meaning, as in this case, the rabbis list more trade-offs, but the first two trade-offs they say is, oh, you want to be a person who Torah is part of you, it's inside of you, it's active with you, then you're going to lose some sleep and you're going to have to give up some of the things that you typically enjoy. Wait a second. I have a lot of things in my life. I have a lot of demands in my life. I have a lot of interests. All true. They don't have to be given up. But if we want to build a certain type of lifestyle, then there's a certain cheshbon nefesh, which has to happen at a certain point in time, which says, I'm going to immerse more deeply in Torah to get to a certain place. And in order to do so, I'm willing to give up X. Now, there was a few months back on Yom Ha'atzmaut, I did a short video where we highlighted the difference between nidivut and mesirut nefesh. Nidivut is a very beautiful thing. We're all very familiar with it. Nidivut means that I'm going to give something to someone. I'm going to give money. I'm going to give time. So a nadiv lev, a nadiv ruach, someone who has this giving or this generosity of heart or of spirit, we've talked about it, is a very, very fine person. And we all strive to do that. But then there's another level that we have less of an opportunity to do. And that is to sacrifice. Now, you'll push back and say, well, wait a minute. I sacrifice every day. I sacrifice for my children every day. It's true. We sacrifice for our children every day. We sacrifice for other people in our lives whom we love. We sacrifice for them every day. But now we're saying, am I willing to sacrifice something to build a life of Torah on a level that I won't be able to achieve otherwise? And the rabbis say, you want to get there? You want to get to that level? Understand that I'm going to give up X and be prepared to do so. So that's a very big thing. So again, headline, to be a superstar parent. That's our headline. Drop down is, we're going to take the position today that to be a superstar parent, a person has to own Torah on a certain level. Own Torah on a certain level. Kinyan HaTorah. Perek Shishi, 6 Perek of Pirkei Avot. Drop down one more step. If I want to own Torah, I've got to be ready to say, step one, I'm willing to be moser nefesh. I'm going to give something up to gain. Now, why does that transform a person? It's an obvious question. I'm going to answer it, although any of you can answer it in a second. It transforms a person when a person makes a commitment, like we do to our children or our grandchildren, when we make a commitment that says, my commitment is not limited to what I can do straight up. My commitment is driven by whatever has to be done, even if it means me giving up something I like. Now, the classic example is, in education, we always saw a difference between a child who grew up in Israel and a child who grew up in America. And I'm generalizing, of course.
Okay.
but it's important to highlight. Generally speaking, the child who grew up in Israel is a little different, has a little bit of a different life perspective, because they either went through the army or Sherut Leumi or the national service, and they had to sacrifice for something. Now, everybody sacrifices. Like we said, we sacrifice to build chesed organizations.
Very good about it. He can see about being a parent.
Right? We sacrifice. But now we're talking about, one second, I know this is good for me. I know it's going to build me. I'm not going to see the results immediately, but I'm going to sacrifice to become something over time. Some of your children, many of your children whom I know, have sacrificed. Some are rabbis, some are doctors, many are leaders, becoming leaders, so they've sacrificed. So you know what it means to see them do it. And of course, I want to reiterate, we sacrifice all the time for things. But now the Torah is saying, 1 second, you're going to have mi'ut shena and mi'ut ta'anug. If you want to be a person of Torah so that you will ultimately be that more successful everything, jot it down and say, I'm ready to give something else, something up. Good. Perek goes further and says that in order to grow in Torah, I have to become vulnerable. What does it mean, vulnerable? The rabbis use the following terms: Shemi'at ozen, Shimush Chachamim, and Pilpul Talmidim, Shoel Meshiv. Shemi'at ozen means I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to learn. And even if what you teach me turns my perspective completely upside down, and I've been living my perspective, following that perspective for decades, I'm still okay with it. I'm still okay with it. So Shemi'at Ozen means my ears are truly open. I'm ready to hear what you have to tell me, even if it means a total shift for me. Shimush Chachamim, I think, demands even greater vulnerability, which means I'm going to bring people into my life, people of knowledge, and I'm going to put trust in them. Now, I'll say, for me personally, I trust God a lot, completely. You know, we all have our moments, but completely. And I trust the people whom I love dearly, right? But putting my trust beyond that into a teacher, that's another challenge. That's less easy. You know, we're not kids. We've seen a lot. The world is not always a perfect place. So the rabbis say, though, that the next step is to be able to trust your teacher and to invest in that person. And what are we saying when we put these first 2 points together? We're saying Shemi'at Ozen and Shimush Chachamim essentially mean I'm open, I'm vulnerable. In other words, the perspective shift is that one person listens to learn and the other person listens to learn and to grow, to become. And that's a very big thing. And it applies to any area of learning, whether it be Torah-related learning or any other type of learning. If I'm reading a book, am I reading this lady's autobiography or this person's diary or whatever this book might be about because I want to pass the time doing something interesting, which is great? Or am I reading the book because I want to take the ideas, I want to own things, I want to change as a result? That's a different commitment. And that's why it's so interesting, and just in a silly way, the people from the second category, the people who want to own what's in the book, never miss the introduction. Never. Because if you're reading a book, to take it and make it your book, you can't possibly read it without the introduction because you have no context. You have no foundation to build from. So our rabbis are saying in this case, check yourself. Check yourself. What is the intent, the approach of my learning? Is the approach of my learning to hear nice ideas and to dedicate an hour to Torah or 10 or whatever it might be, which is great? Or is the approach of my learning to become more? If the approach of my learning is to become more, then shmi'at ozen, then I listen differently, I internalize the ideas differently, I take notes, I invest in the person, and I grow that way. That's a very different Torah perspective than going to a class. Again, going to a class is very, very valuable, super. But where am I on this thing? So our rabbis say, you want to be someone who's koneh Torah, and from our perspective, that means that you will become that much of a greater parent. You want to be that person? Be a person who's shomea ozen, who's really truly listening, who's mishamesh, the author or the teacher, which means I become part of that person's mindset. I buy into their way of thinking and their approach, because most teachers, they don't give a one-off this or a one-off that. What they're teaching stands on its own, but it's always part of a total perspective. And when you engage with a teacher and you invest in that person's life and that person's approach, it means that you connect the dots the way he or she did. And that means that not only are you gaining the information at hand, but you're starting to build these building blocks of a worldview that the Torah uniquely provides. Other things provide worldviews as well that are valuable, but the Torah obviously provides a unique worldview. And someone who's engaged and vulnerable and open and is mishamesh, his teacher and hers, is someone that can connect those dots and grow from the learning, not simply intellectualize, but internalize. It's about that level of vulnerability that yields growth. And the next step that our rabbis say is that a person will be mefapel talmidim, in other words, willing to go back and forth on something. And I look forward to the day then when this could be a little less mechanical, and it'll be easier for us to be back and forth and share ideas like would be typically done in a typical venue. But the rabbis say that that's very important. A person has to be willing to ask the question, allow for a comeback that may make sense, may not make sense, may at times feel a little embarrassing. Sometimes I ask questions in the classes I attend. I don't know. Maybe I missed the point. Maybe the point was already mentioned. Maybe the point was mentioned in class before. Who cares? Who cares? If the question is in my mind and I'm a serious person and I'm committed to this thing, I'm committed to asking. So first tranche is to become someone who is koneh Torah, who buys, who earns Torah. I have to be willing to sacrifice something, and making the perspective that I'm sacrificing. Like again, some of your children have for their profession, we all do in other ways. If I'm sacrificing for Torah, I'm going to approach it differently. I'm going to own it differently. Step 2, now that I've made the commitment to sacrifice, I make the commitment to be vulnerable, which means I'm listening to learn, to own, not to hear. I'm listening to practice, not to know. I'm going to engage with the teacher, learn his or her way of looking at things, and be willing to ask questions even when they're not so easy to ask. And finally, our rabbis say another very, very interesting thing, and it's something that we know, we say it all the time, but it's something that our rabbis punch out and make a very strong point of. And they say that when you learn something, you should learn it to teach it. You should learn it to teach it. In other words, when you're listening to the class or you're reading the book, you should be engaged to the level where you may not give it over exactly the way the teacher did because you're different and your vantage points are different and your world experiences are different and the way you express ideas is different. All true, all appropriate. But when I'm learning to teach, it's a very, very different world. Very different world than simply learning to know. And every day in the beracha leading up to Kiryat Shema, we say this: Lilmod, lelamed, lishmor, laasot, ulkayem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, give us the strength to learn and to teach. And I'll tell you, when you're approaching something, whether it be class or something you're reading, with the perspective of, I want to be able to teach this, your attention level is clearly much elevated, altogether different. Your focus, your intensity, you're on it, you will own it. And if that means that the class is 40 minutes and you can tell it over in 7, that's fine. Because as you go on, when you've made the commitment lilmod u'lelamed, to learn and to own, to be able to say it over and repeat it, and you focused on the class to that extent, then over time, you'll be able to recap more and more of it. Okay, good. That was our little overview and introduction. In order to drive the point home, I wanted to move beyond Pirkei Avot and just touch somewhat on some of the fundamentals of Shabbat. What's the relationship? The relationship is as follows. Our rabbis say that a person should be learning Hilchot Shabbat his or her entire life. Wow. What do you mean? I should learn the halachot, the laws of Yom Tov, of holidays, till I pretty much got them down, and the laws of kashrut, of eating appropriately, pretty much till I got them down. Of course, review every so often. But the laws of Shabbat, I should be involved in forever? Yeah. Why? Because Shabbat is a world. Shabbat is our lifeline. And the laws of Shabbat provide our portal to the world. They provide our way of looking at everything that we engage. So, with that in mind, and with where we started, in terms of a person being maknet Torah, earning it, buying it, engaged in a different level, in order to become that much more of a parent and otherwise, and we'll go back to that soon, let's talk a little bit about Torah. So we talked a few weeks ago in a different context that on the positive side of the laws of Shabbat, we have the Zachor side, which essentially says that a person has to be mehabed and me'aneg on Shabbat. Meaning what? Meaning the positive side of Shabbat means that I'm mehabed, I respect it, which as we talked about means I prepare for it. And the preparation could be people going to the supermarket the day before, particularly men, and preparation for a Dvar Torah, a chesed idea, a chesed experience that comes to the table. So to be mehabed Shabbat as a drop down from the positive mitzvah of Zachor, to remember, means to prepare. We talked about it, quick review. The second drop down on the positive side is oneg, aneg, to bring pleasure to Shabbat, because Shabbat has this thing built in Call it neshamaya tera, that extra soulfulness of the day that becomes infused into us only on that day, or whatever it might be. Shabbat has the ability to bring pleasure to those who bring it pleasure. And what do our rabbis say in this case? There are 4 components to it. And again, this is just a quick review. The first one is tefillah. The second one is limud, so prayer, learning. The third is mishpacha, family, around the seudot, the meals. And the fourth is my private time. So, Shabbat is the headline, as an area to begin to learn with sacrifice, giving something up, the intention of making it mine and owning it so I can teach it. Step A, let's look at the positive stuff. The positive, zachor, to remember, is broken down to kibud, respect, meaning preparation for the day, and oneg, to invest in the day so that the day gives back to me. And the oneg is broken down into prayer, learning, family, and private personal time for me to bring that notion of menucha, of revitalization, of recreation, of new and fresh growth and opportunity to my mind and my heart. The next area of Shabbat, that if we're going to take what the Pirkei Avot mentioned and do it the ma'aseh, and test it and work it today immediately, is the idea of uvda dechol. This is one of those fuzzier kind of things, but it's extremely important, and I want to touch on it before we get to the little more complex stuff. Uvda dechol means that I've got to, in my own way, and this is very personal, in my own way, I've got to make distinctions between this day and other days. Now, how do we do it? Again, you could go back to point 1. We do it by how we spend the day. We're not running off to the office or wherever it might be. Obviously, we got that. But that's not what we're talking about here. We have other laws to tell us about that. What we're talking about here is those subtle changes that a person makes in how he carries himself on that day. Somebody asked me an interesting question a couple of weeks ago. He said, my family dresses casually on Shabbat. This is how they dress. I want to be with my family on Shabbat, with my wife and children. I'd rather not dress casually, but I'm not going to be away from my wife and children on Shabbat. Any suggestions? So I asked him, it sounded silly to him, but I said, so what kind of shorts do you wear on Shabbat? He said, I wear like a bathing suit short. I said, okay, I'll tell you what. Next week and going forward, wear a more formal short and not a bathing suit short. He looked at me. I said, yeah, that's something. That's a distinction. Maybe you're not ready to stay in Shabbat clothes for the whole day. Maybe you will be someday. Maybe you'll never be able to do that. Maybe that's not for you. But if you would typically hang around in a bathing suit short, let's take a step, knowing it's not the ultimate place to be, but it's a real quantifiable distinction that separates you in your mind from where you were on Friday or Tuesday, and where you will make the point to your family without distancing your family from you. And maybe in a year or 5 or whenever, your clothing will go to another level as you grow, and that'll be more consistent with you. But this notion of uvda dechol, as it relates to halachot Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat, the notion of doing something that's very much like a weekday is, there are general halachic criteria for it like anything else, but it's very subjective. And it needs to be nuanced. It needs the notion of binah, where we split hairs a little bit to make subtle distinctions that make a point primarily to me in terms of my own growth and sense of self and where I want to be, and secondarily to the people around me. Okay, so far? Let's go a little bit further with this approach of niknot Torah, to engage Torah in a way where I'm going to know it, I'm going to own it, and I'm going to build with it. The gist of Shabbat is the lo ta'aseh side, the things that we're prohibited from doing. And over here it gets spectacular and fascinating beyond words. What do we have? We have the shamor side, the lo ta'aseh, the prohibitions, and those are based, as we know, in the 39 melachot, the 39 things that the Jewish people did in order to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Again, headline, Lo ta'aseh, prohibitions on Shabbat. Where do they come from? A fascinating place. They come from the place that was contrived and designed and built to house God on the planet. That construction effort was deemed stopped on Shabbatot, and therefore we look to what we did to build it, which had to stop on Shabbat, to say anything that we did thousands of years ago in the desert to build the Mishkan that was stopped on Shabbat tells me what we will stop doing on Shabbat forever. Good. So they're called the Lamed Tet, the 39 Melachot. Good, the 39 actions, or the 39 elements of productivity, let's say. So let's use a few examples. Let's say, for example, the wool would be dyed a certain color. We know we had red and we had purple and we had vibrant and strong colors in the Mishkan. The wool would have to be dyed a certain color. Now you're in the desert. How does that work? So here's how it works. They planted certain flowers, what would be flowers, planted seeds that would grow and become certain flowers, and then took those flowers and from those flowers made the dye for the wool or the other fabrics that we used. Okay? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, we want these tapestries, we want the parochet, we want the kaporet, let's say, we want the covering of the Mishkan, all of which have to be dyed certain colors. Got it. How do we get dye? Well, we need to have a source for the dye. It could be the chilazon, that snail-like thing that grew in the water, that we believe that chelet, that vibrant, beautiful blue that some people use on tzitzit, came from. Or it could come from plants, where most dyes come from. So therefore, because I needed a dye, I go back to step one, which is putting seeds in the ground to grow the plant that would give me the flower, that would enable me to get the dye. And we say that you can't plant seeds in the ground on Shabbat. Why? Because way back when in the Mishkan, I needed to create some dye for my fabrics. And in order to ultimately get there, I had to plant some plants. Fantastic. So that means that Zorea, planting, is considered an Av Melacha, a daddy Melacha, or a primary action that can't be done on Shabbat. Okay? We'll get there. Primary action. Av, daddy, father Melacha. Where does it come from? Now we know where it comes from in this case. I need that beautiful red color for that fabric ultimately. So as a result of that, I can't plant seeds on Shabbat. Not then and not now. And that's your top line prohibition. But now, we said there are 39 top line prohibitions. You drop down from that, and some of the rabbis say there are up to 39 junior prohibitions related to each top line prohibition. 39 junior prohibitions related to each top line prohibition. What does that mean? It means as follows. If planting is prohibited on Shabbat, then anything that can be done for a plant to grow is also prohibited. So, watering a plant on Shabbat is prohibited because it's just another form of helping something grow. Oh, wait a second. Watering a plant on Shabbat is prohibited. Putting flowers in water would be prohibited if those flowers would benefit from the water. What about pouring water from your cup? Somebody sitting at a table on the grass and decides to pour out their water. That would also be prohibited. So where do we end up here? It's very, very interesting. We'll give a few more examples. And I'm giving this over to drive the point of the importance of immersion in the detail and the ownership of Torah. Shabbat, the cornerstone of who we are, what we are, how we identify ourselves to the world, made up of positive and prohibitive. The prohibitive goes back to the tabernacle. 39 key areas, junior areas as well. What do? We dig into those to learn from them. How does it work? We go back to the source of each of these things. So the great example is planting. I can't plant seeds in the ground. If a person puts seeds in the ground on Shabbat, that person was transgressed a melacha on Shabbat. But what if a person waters a plant? The same thing. I'm enabling growth. I can't enable growth on Shabbat because when I enable growth on Shabbat in order to do X, that became stopped. That was stopped, even though it was for the Mishkan. Let's take another example. Chodesh. In order to put seeds in the ground, to ultimately have my flour, from which I will ultimately have my dye, in order to put seeds in the ground, I have to soften the ground. I have to soften it. That's called chodesh, literally translated as to plow the land. So if someone goes ahead and plows the land on Shabbat, well, that person was oved, transgressed one of the prohibitions on Shabbat. But what it also means is the toladot, the children of that daddy law, which are to soften or prep the land in any way possible, is asur, is prohibited on Shabbat. To prep the land in any way possible. Well, this brings up interesting questions. Can I drag a chair on dirt and put grooves in the land? Can I wheel a stroller on soft dirt and put grooves in the land? Because I resemble what I did by doing that. The answers are that if there's a possibility of putting the grooves, but a reasonable possibility that I won't put the grooves, then there's no problem dragging the chair or wheeling the stroller. But if I'm definitely, unequivocally going to put grooves in the soil by dragging the chair, let's say a heavy chair, then I'm prohibited from doing that on Shabbat. What does all this mean? Let's do one more. Borer. Borer was, they had the grain and that would be grown in order to ultimately use it for a purpose, could have been a third or fourth step removed purpose on Shabbat, in the Mishkan, and that grain would be separated, the wheat from the chaff. So from that, we have laws like dash, to separate, and laws like borer, to separate. And what do we take from that? Very interesting thing. That if two things are sitting on my plate, for example, if two things are sitting on my plate, and I leave one behind, I make that the unwanted food with no intention of eating it at all on Shabbat, and I just eat the other one, that's a problem. So what do? Well, if you have food on your plate, right? We eat the first thing we prefer, and then we eat the second thing within a reasonable period of time. But there are several laws specific to this, to borer. So where are we going with this? Point is as follows. Judaism is a world. Hilchot Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat, for example, are a subworld within that huge world. When we get to we drill down, in this case, for example, when we say, you know what? There's 39 prohibitions. We mentioned 3 very briefly. There are very practical elements to them, most of which we know indirectly and we don't transgress. But the knowledge is liberating. But this type of knowledge, for example, the laws of Shabbat, require a different level of focus, a different level of attention, because point A builds on point B and we have to own them. I have to understand what is considered separating. Is kibbeh hamda considered separating? If I take the kibbeh out of the liquid, it's not. But why not? What about, okay, so this type of learning means I'm going to be breaking my head. It's going to hurt. I'm going to be challenged. I'm going to listen to a class on Hilchot Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat, for example. That's 45 minutes. And I might own 10. But that goes back to point A, to the Mesirut Nefesh, to the commitment, to the sacrifice to own something. And that's what our rabbis are suggesting. That's what our rabbis are talking about. You know, when we take on a hobby, we want to learn how to paint. We want to learn how to play tennis. We want to learn, or we want to learn a new career. We make a commitment to that training, to that college program, to the graduate school program, to the residency program, whatever it might be, and all the sacrifice that comes with it, because we want to own it. We want to become it. We want it to be who we are. It's no different with Limud Torah. It's no different with learning Torah. And if we want to go to another level in our lives in terms of our learning, we drill deeper, we work harder, we become more vulnerable. We take the laws of Shabbat, for example, positive, overall, and negative, like we briefly mentioned, and we say, you know what? It really does sound like Chinese to me right now, but I'm going to come back to the issue of planting, and I'm going to come back to the issue of plowing, and I'm going to come back to the issue of separating, and I'm going to open the book, and I'm going to look at the pictures, because they're very helpful, and I'm going to be able to put them together in my mind and own them, because that's who we are as a people. You know, I was mentioning to my children the other day, just, you know, tangentially, how we're so fortunate, we're so immeasurably fortunate to have a paradigm of Torah through which to approach the world. I don't know how other people do it. My heart breaks for them because they don't have an immovable foundation. They don't have an absolute emet. They don't have it. So today, this matters. Yesterday, it didn't matter. Today, I can destroy this. Tomorrow, I'll build that. Flit from one thing to the other. We have an unequivocal place of truth. You want to be an outstanding parent? Be an outstanding scholar of Torah. And again, I'm using the word scholar loosely. When I'm a scholar, it means I learn something to a level where I can give it over and I'm comfortable doing it. That's a different level of personhood, of who I am, and it enables a different level of parenting. And it transforms us in terms of our Torah learning from a participant from a listener to a participant. I want to be a participant. I want to own it. So we'll close with this. There's an interesting short couple of sentences that precedes what we learned in this perek of the Pirkei Avot, where the rabbis say, Derech Eretz kadma the Torah, Torah kadma the Derech Eretz. That the ways of the world come before Torah, and Torah comes before the ways of the world. Now, we learned this together a handful of weeks ago, and we said that most of the rabbis say, and the way we live our lives is, Derech Eretz kadma Torah, meaning a person has to become a vessel of a certain quality in order to internalize Torah and to maximize Torah. But our rabbis say now, towards the end of Pirkei Avot, you know what, it's true, but really there's both sides. This thing goes both ways. What does that mean? It means that it's true. I have to build myself to a certain level in order to be able to receive Torah. But at the other hand, the Torah is going to continue to build me so that I build myself to a certain level. I can receive Torah. The Torah builds me. I can receive a greater level of Torah. That builds me. I can receive a greater level of Torah. This happens with sacrifice, with participation, with engagement, with giving up something, with crying sometimes because I simply don't understand and it hurts and I want to own it because it's mine. It's who I am. Should everybody on this call, including me, which I don't do it, know by heart the 39 laws of Shabbat? Do I know them by heart? Absolutely not. Do I know them as absolutely crystal clear as I should? Absolutely not. Am I committed to do so? Absolutely. Can everybody on this call do so? Absolutely. Lo b'shamayim, lo me'ever hayam. Right? The Chumash tells us in Sefer Devarim that nothing is out of reach if I want it. So, today's topic was to be a superstar parent. There are great parenting books out there. Many of the people whose names I'm looking at could write a book because you've already built outstanding children. And we all know each other, many of us. And I know we know each other's children. And we know what we've all committed to do that. And that's forever. At the same time, let's think about moving from listener to participant, rolling up our sleeves, opening the books, breaking our heads, and sacrificing, because that will build us to a different level of parenting, where I believe we go from being, God willing, great parents and very successful parents to superstar parents, because we become kelim, vessels of Torah. And that enables our children to get infinitely more from us than they could get otherwise. Good. Anybody, any thoughts, questions, any ideas, any challenges, any? Okay. Great. All right. I want to, okay. All right. We're going to post the class on YouTube. And I want to thank everybody for accommodating the time change. And we're going to stay with the 11 o'clock Tuesdays with God's help. I want to thank you all very much. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Ricky.
you.
This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you.